Let your shoulders drop. Let the day fall away behind you. I'm glad you're here. Wherever you've come from tonight, whatever the day asked of you, you can leave it at the door. You don't need to bring it in here with you. This is a space for resting. Nothing more. You don't have to listen carefully. You don't have to remember anything. You don't even have to stay awake for all of it. In fact, if your eyes are heavy already, that's a good sign. That means your body already knows what to do. So let your eyes close if you'd like, or let them stay soft and half open, whatever feels natural. There's no right way to begin this. Before we begin, feel free to share what time it is and where you are listening from. It's a small thing, but I like knowing that somewhere out there in a dark room or a quiet car or a bed with the covers pulled up to the chin, someone is settling in the same way you are right now. Different time zones, different cities, different lives, all of us doing the same simple thing, letting the day go. Tonight we're going to talk about weight. Not the kind you can put on a scale, but the kind that gathers in the chest and the shoulders and the back of the mind. The weight of carrying too much for too long. The weight of a mind that won't stop working even when the body is exhausted and ready for rest. Most of us have learned somewhere along the way that thinking harder is the answer to almost everything. If something feels uncertain, we think about it more. If something feels unfinished, we go back over it again. If something feels heavy, we tighten our grip on it, as though gripping harder were the same thing as caring more. Tonight, I want to offer a different idea, gently, without asking you to believe it all at once. The idea is simply this. Sometimes the most caring thing you can do for a burden you've been carrying is to set it down for a while and trust that it will still be there, lighter perhaps when you pick it back up tomorrow. I'm going to tell you a number of stories tonight, old in feeling though new in their telling, the way the best stories often are. Each one is about someone who carried something too tightly for too long and who found, often by accident, a way to loosen their grip. You don't need to follow every detail. You don't need to remember the names. If your mind drifts in and out, that's not a failure of attention. That's simply what a tired mind does when it finally feels safe enough to let go. So let your breath settle into its own rhythm now. Not a rhythm you're managing, just the one that's already there, the one your body has been keeping all day without your help. In a moment, we'll begin the first story. It takes place high in a stretch of grazing country where the grass grows thin and silver in the moonlight, and the wind never quite stops moving across the hills. But first, just take a moment to notice where your body meets whatever is holding it up. The mattress, the cushion, the seat beneath you if you're listening somewhere other than a bed. Notice that this surface is already doing the work of holding your weight. You don't have to add your own effort to that work. You can simply let it hold you the way it's been built to do, the way it's been waiting to do this entire day. High in a stretch of grazing country, where the hills rolled out in long silver waves under the moon and the wind moved constantly through the grass, there lived a young shepherd named Pell. Pell had inherited his flock from an uncle who had died suddenly one winter, leaving behind 63 sheep, a sturdy fence, and an old dog named Birch who had worked these same hills for nearly a decade. Pell had grown up in the village below, helping occasionally with the lambing season, but he had never been the one solely responsible for a flock before, and the weight of that responsibility had settled into him almost the moment his uncle's affairs were finally signed over to his name. The first night Pell brought the flock in alone, he found himself standing at the gate long after the last sheep had passed through, simply staring at them in the fading light, trying to count them. He counted 61. His chest tightened immediately. He counted again, more slowly this time, pointing at each sheep as Birch had taught him, and this time he reached 63. Relief flooded through him, but it didn't last. By the time he had walked back to his small cottage at the base of the hill, the worry had already returned, gnawing at the edge of his thoughts. What if he had counted wrong the second time? What if 2 sheep had wandered off into the dark hills while he wasn't looking, lost to a ravine or a predator, and he simply hadn't noticed? That night, Pell didn't sleep. He lay in his bed listening to the wind moving against the cottage walls, and every time it gusted harder than usual, he imagined it was the sound of the fence breaking or a sheep crying out somewhere in the dark. Around midnight, he could no longer bear it. He got up, lit a lantern, and walked back out to the field to count again. This time he counted 62. His heart began pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat. He walked the length of the fence in the cold night air, the lantern light swinging shadows across the grass, searching for a gap, a break, anything that might explain a missing sheep. He found nothing wrong with the fence. He counted a third time, his hands trembling slightly from the cold and from his own rising panic, and this time he reached 63 again. He stood there in the dark for a long while, lantern held high, breathing hard, utterly confused about how the same flock could produce 3 different numbers in the space of a single hour. This pattern continued for nearly 2 months. Pell counted his sheep in the evening, counted them again before bed, and more often than not woke at least once in the night to count them a third time, convinced that sleep itself was a kind of negligence he couldn't afford. His face grew thin, the skin beneath his eyes darkened. Birch, the old dog, began watching him with what Pell could have sworn was concern, following him out to the field each time he rose in the night, sitting patiently at his side while he counted and recounted in the moonlight. One evening, an old shepherd named Corin, who tended a much larger flock on the far side of the valley and had known Pell's uncle for many years, stopped by the cottage to see how the young man was managing. He found Pell out by the fence at dusk in the middle of his evening count, his lips moving silently as he pointed at each sheep. Corin waited until Pell had finished, watched him sigh in temporary relief at the final number, and then asked gently how many times a day Pell counted the flock. Pell admitted, somewhat ashamed, that it was often 4 or 5 times, sometimes more on nights when sleep wouldn't come at all. Corin nodded slowly, not with judgment, but with the quiet recognition of someone who had perhaps walked a similar road himself many years before. He asked Pell what he thought the counting was actually protecting him from. Pell considered the question and said that he supposed he was trying to protect the flock, to make sure nothing was lost, to catch any problem before it became serious. Corin asked whether the counting itself had ever once prevented a sheep from wandering off, or whether it had only ever told him, after the fact, whether one already had. Pell opened his mouth to answer and then closed it again, because he realized he didn't actually know. In 2 months of obsessive counting, he had never once caught a sheep in the act of escaping. He had only ever discovered, sometimes hours later, sometimes not at all, whether the number matched what he expected. Corin walked with Pell along the fence line as the light faded further, And as they walked, he told him something his own teacher had told him decades earlier, in almost the exact same spot. He said that the fence was not built to be checked, it was built to hold. That was its entire purpose, the reason for every post driven into the ground and every length of wire strung between them. A shepherd who trusts his fence walks the line once a week to look for damage, mends what needs mending, and then lets the fence do the job it was built for. A shepherd who doesn't trust his fence walks the line every hour, every night, exhausting himself with checking, and in doing so misses the very thing the fence was meant to give him: rest. Pell asked what would happen if, one night, despite all the checking, a sheep really did go missing. Corin said that this was always possible, that no fence in the world was perfect, that no amount of counting could change this basic truth. But he pointed to Birch, sitting quietly at Pell's heel, ears occasionally swiveling toward sounds in the dark hills that neither man could hear. He said that Birch's nose and ears were doing every single night a kind of watching that Pell's anxious counting could never match. The dog would know, long before any lantern-lit count ever could, if something in the flock was wrong. That was what the dog had been bred and trained for, generation after generation, the same way the fence had been built for holding rather than for constant inspection. Pell's job, Corin said gently, was not to personally verify hour by hour that disaster hadn't struck. His job was to build a good fence, keep a good dog, and then trust the systems he had built enough to actually sleep at night, knowing that if something did go wrong, he would learn of it through Birch's barking or through the fence's obvious damage, not through some constant, exhausting vigilance that left him too tired to properly care for the flock during the daylight hours when his attention actually mattered most. That night, for the first time in 2 months, Pell counted his sheep only once, at dusk, the way Corin had suggested. He reached 63, the number settled in his chest without the usual doubt trailing behind it, and he went to bed. He woke twice in the night out of old habit, his body still trained toward worry, but both times he made himself stay in bed, listening instead for any sound of distress from Birch or from the flock itself. He heard only the wind moving through the grass, the occasional soft bleat of a sheep shifting in its sleep, and beneath all of it, the steady, undisturbed quiet of a hillside where nothing at all was wrong. In the morning, all 63 sheep stood waiting at the gate, exactly as they always had. Pell continued shepherding that same flock for the next 30 years. He counted once a day in the evening light the way Corin had taught him, and he slept through nearly every night that followed, trusting his fence, trusting his dog, trusting that not every form of care has to look like constant checking. He told his own apprentice many years later that the hardest lesson of shepherding wasn't learning to watch the flock closely. It was learning when to stop watching and to trust instead in the quiet, steady systems built to do the watching for him. Let us rest here a moment. Feel the body soft and heavy just where it is. If there's something tonight that you've been checking and rechecking, some worry you keep returning to as though one more look will finally settle it for good, you don't have to solve that right now. You can simply notice that the fence is still standing, that the dog is still listening, that whatever systems and people and quiet structures exist around your life are doing more of the holding than your tired, anxious mind gives them credit for. You're allowed to count once tonight, and then let the number rest. Your breath is already finding its own rhythm. There's another story waiting, this one set in a small harbour town where the fog rolls in most evenings, and a particular lamplighter spent years convinced that every lamp in town depended entirely on the strength of his own 2 arms. But there's no need to rush there. Stay here a while longer in the stillness after the first story, and let your body continue settling into whatever is holding it. In a small harbour town where the fog rolled in most evenings, thick and grey, swallowing the tops of the fishing boats moored along the quay, there lived a lamplighter named Aldous. Each evening, just as the light began to fade and the cobblestone streets grew slick with the damp air rolling in off the water, Aldous would walk his route with a long brass pole, reaching up to light each of the town's 41 street lamps one after another, working his way from the harbour up through the winding lanes to the small chapel at the top of the hill. He had been doing this work for nearly 20 years, ever since his own father, the town's previous lamplighter, had grown too old to manage the steep streets. Aldous took the work seriously, more seriously in fact than most people in town realized. Each lamp in his mind was not simply a small flame behind glass. It was a promise to the fishermen who would return after dark, their boats heavy with the day's catch, navigating the last stretch of harbour by the lights along the shore. It was a promise to the old widow who lived alone above the bakery and walked to evening prayers by the light of the lamps along the chapel road. It was a promise, in some way Aldous couldn't quite put into words, that the town itself would not be left in darkness, regardless of fog or storm or his own exhaustion. This sense of responsibility had grown over the years into something heavier than it needed to be. Aldous had developed a habit of returning to each lamp, sometimes twice, sometimes 3 times in a single evening, convinced that the flame might have grown too low or too high, or that the wind off the water might have disturbed the glass enough to let in a draught that would eventually snuff the light out entirely. On particularly foggy nights, the kind where the moisture in the air seemed to want to smother every flame it touched, Aldous would walk his entire route 4 or 5 times before midnight, checking each lamp again and again, his legs aching, his lungs burning from the damp, salty air, his mind unable to rest until he had personally verified lamp by lamp that the entire town remained lit. His wife, a patient woman named Ressa, who ran a small shop selling rope and tackle to the fishermen, had watched this habit grow for years with quiet concern. She noticed that Aldous rarely slept through a full night anymore, rising instead at odd hours, certain that some particular lamp, the one at the bend by the old fish market, or the one near the chapel steps, needed checking again. He had grown thin, his hands often trembling slightly from exhaustion, and the joy he had once taken in his work, the quiet pride of watching the town's lights flicker on one by one each evening, had slowly curdled into something closer to dread. One particularly thick, foggy evening, after Aldous had already walked his route twice and was preparing to set out a 3rd time, Ressa finally asked him to sit with her for a few minutes by the fire before he went back out. Reluctantly, he agreed, though his foot tapped anxiously against the floor the entire time, his mind already halfway up the hill toward the lamp by the chapel steps. Ressa asked him a simple question. She asked him what exactly he believed would happen if one particular lamp, just one out of 41, happened to go dark for a portion of the night. Aldous considered this, his jaw tight, and admitted that he wasn't entirely sure, only that the thought of it filled him with a kind of dread he couldn't fully explain. Ressa reminded him gently of something he seemed to have forgotten in his exhaustion. She reminded him that every fisherman in this harbour had been navigating these waters since before either of them was born, guided not only by the town's lamps, but by the stars, by the particular shape of the harbour mouth they had memorized as boys, by the sound of the waves against the rocks that told them, even in total darkness, exactly how close they were to shore. The lamps helped, the lamps mattered, but the fishermen were not, and had never been, entirely dependent on any single one of them. She reminded him too that the old widow above the bakery had walked these streets for 60 years, knew every cobblestone and every turn by memory, and would manage perfectly well, even if she occasionally had to feel her way past one darkened lamp on her way to evening prayers. Aldous sat quietly for a long while, staring into the fire, turning this over in his mind. He admitted eventually that somewhere over the years he had stopped believing that he was one part of the town's safety, working alongside the fisherman's own skill and the widow's own familiarity with these streets, and had instead come to believe that he was the entire foundation upon which everyone else's safety rested, that any flicker or failure on his part would bring some terrible consequence crashing down on people he cared about. Ressa didn't tell him to stop caring about his work. She didn't suggest that the lamps didn't matter, or that his diligence over the years hadn't made a real difference to the people who walked these streets after dark. She simply asked him to try something different, just for one evening. She asked him to walk his route once, carefully and attentively, exactly as he always had, at the start of each night, and then to come home and trust that single, careful pass to be enough. Aldous protested at first, the old anxious habit pulling at him hard, but something in Ressa's steady, patient expression made him pause. He agreed, reluctantly, to try. That evening, he walked his route once, lighting each lamp with the same care he always brought to the work, checking the level of oil, adjusting each wick to a clean, steady flame, moving methodically from the harbour up through the winding streets to the chapel at the top of the hill. When he finished, instead of turning back to begin again, he forced himself to walk home. The first hour was agony. He sat by the fire with Ressa, his leg bouncing, his mind cataloguing every lamp along his route, certain that at least one of them must be flickering by now, must need his attention. But as the second hour passed, and then the third, with no urgent knock at the door, no shouted warning from a fisherman lost in sudden darkness, something in Aldous' chest began to loosen just slightly for what felt like the first time in years. He slept that night, not perfectly, but more fully than he had in longer than he could remember. In the morning, he walked his route again before dawn, as he always did, to extinguish the lamps for the day, and found every single one of them still burning steadily, exactly as he had left them the night before. Aldous didn't transform overnight. Old habits, especially ones built on real care for real people, don't dissolve in a single evening. But over the following months, he slowly trained himself to walk his route once each night, then trust the lamps, the fisherman's own skill, the widow's own familiarity with her streets, and his wife's steady reminder that he was one good and important part of a much larger system, not the entire weight holding the town's safety on his own 2 shoulders. He lit those 41 lamps for another 15 years, until electric lighting finally came to the harbour town, and made his particular craft obsolete. He told his own son, who had grown up watching him walk that foggy route every evening, that the most important thing he had ever learned in all his years of lamp lighting had nothing to do with oil or wicks or the particular angle needed to light a lamp in a strong wind. It was learning that doing his work well, with full attention and real care, was entirely different from believing that his own constant, anxious vigilance was the only thing standing between the town and the dark. Let us rest here a moment. Feel the body soft and heavy just where it is. If you've been walking the same worried route again and again tonight, checking something once should have been enough to check, you can let yourself stop at one pass for tonight. The lamp is lit. The fishermen know these waters. The widow knows these streets by heart. You did your part well, and that's allowed to be enough. Your breath continues at its own pace, unhurried, unmanaged, simply moving in and out the way it always has. There's a quieter story waiting now about a young archer who believed that hitting the target required gripping the bow as tightly as his fear could manage, and what an old teacher showed him instead in a clearing at the edge of a forest where the wind moved constantly through the high branches. Let your body sink a little further into whatever is holding it. There's nowhere else for you to be right now. At the edge of a wide forest where tall pines grew close together and the wind moved constantly through their high branches with a sound like distant water, there stood a training ground where a small group of students learned archery from an old teacher named Maren. Among her students was a young man named Isa, talented in many ways, quick to learn new forms and patterns, but plagued by a problem that had begun to define his entire practice. The harder Isa tried to hit the target, the more often he missed. This had not always been the case. In his early months of training, before he understood enough to be afraid of failure, Isa had shot with a kind of easy, unconcerned accuracy that had impressed even Maren, who rarely praised her students openly. But as Isa grew more aware of how much his accuracy seemed to matter, both to his own sense of worth and to the quiet judgment of the other students watching him practice, something in his shooting began to change. His grip on the bow grew tighter. His shoulders crept up toward his ears each time he drew the string back. His breath, instead of flowing naturally through each shot, became shallow and held, as though releasing it too soon might somehow throw off his aim. The arrows, more often than not, now flew wide of the target, sometimes embarrassingly so, burying themselves in the soft earth well beyond the straw target, or skittering off at odd angles that made the other students exchange quiet, sympathetic glances. Isa's frustration grew with each missed shot. He began arriving earlier to the training ground and staying later, convinced that more practice, more repetitions, more sheer effort poured into every draw of the bow would eventually force his accuracy to return. Instead, the opposite happened. The more he practiced in this anxious, gripping way, the worse his shooting became, until he found himself missing the target almost entirely on some days, his arrows flying in directions that seemed to have little relationship to where he had actually aimed. One late afternoon, after a particularly disastrous session where Isa hadn't managed to land a single arrow anywhere near the target center, Maren asked the other students to leave for the day and asked Isa to stay behind. He expected criticism, perhaps even a suggestion that he reconsider whether archery was truly suited to him. Instead, Marin simply asked him to hand her his bow. She held it for a moment, running her thumb along the smooth wood of the grip, and then asked Issa to watch closely as she nocked an arrow and drew the string back. Issa watched and noticed immediately something he had somehow never paid attention to before, despite months of training under her guidance. Marin's hand on the bow looked almost relaxed. Her fingers curled around the grip with a kind of loose confidence, not gripping for dear life the way Issa's own hand had taken to doing in recent weeks, but holding the bow the way someone might hold a bird they trusted not to fly away, firm enough to maintain control, but with none of the white-knuckled tension that had become Issa's constant companion. She released the arrow, and it flew straight and true into the center of the target, the sound of impact crisp and satisfying in the quiet evening air. Marin handed the bow back to Issa and asked him to try, but this time, instead of focusing on the target at all, she asked him to focus entirely on the feeling of his own hand around the grip. She told him to notice how tightly he was holding it, on a scale that meant nothing to anyone but himself, and then to consciously loosen that grip by perhaps a third, no more, no less, just enough to notice the difference. Issa nocked an arrow, drew the string back and tried to do as she asked, loosening his grip slightly while still feeling mentally as though he had abandoned all control over the shot. His arrow flew and landed closer to the target than any of his attempts that entire afternoon, though still off to the left of center. Marin nodded and asked him to notice that detail carefully, then to try again, loosening his grip by perhaps another small measure. They continued this way for nearly an hour, Issa shooting arrow after arrow, each time consciously softening his grip just slightly more than the last, and each time, almost without exception, the accuracy of his shots improved, the arrows landing closer and closer to the target center, until finally, on his 9th or 10th attempt, an arrow buried itself almost exactly in the middle of the straw target, eliciting a small, surprised laugh from Issa himself. Marin let him shoot a few more arrows in this loosened state before finally speaking again. She explained that what Issa had been doing for the past several weeks, without realizing it, was treating the bow as though it were the enemy, something that needed to be conquered through sheer force and tension, rather than as a tool that worked with him, responding most precisely when his own body allowed it the freedom to do what it was built to do. She said that fear does this to almost everyone, in almost every kind of work, not only archery. When we become afraid of failing at something, our instinct is almost always to grip harder, to add more tension, more effort, more force, believing somewhere deep down that tightness equals control. But a bow, like a mind, like a body, like nearly anything that requires precision and flow rather than brute strength, performs worse under that kind of gripping tension, not better. The arrow doesn't need to be forced toward the target. It needs a steady hand, a clear eye, and just enough release in the grip to let the bow do the work it was built to do, the way the string and the wood and the careful balance of the entire instrument had been designed over generations of careful craftsmanship to send an arrow flying true without requiring the archer to fight the bow itself every step of the way. Issa asked how he was supposed to maintain this loosened grip when the fear of missing still lived somewhere in his chest, even now, even after a successful shot. Marin considered this for a while, watching the evening light slant through the tall pines at the edge of the clearing. She said that the fear would likely never disappear entirely, Not for Isa, not for her, not for any archer who genuinely cared about hitting the target. But there's a difference, she said, between feeling fear and letting that fear translate directly into the muscles of your hand. The fear can exist somewhere in the back of your awareness, a quiet presence rather than a controlling one. While your hand, trained through practice and through conscious attention to the grip itself, learns to stay loose regardless of what the mind is doing in the background. She told him that the goal was never to eliminate fear entirely, an impossible task for anyone doing work that genuinely mattered to them. The goal was simply to notice again and again whenever that fear began tightening the hand, and to consciously soften the grip back to where it needed to be, trusting that loosened grip far more than the anxious instinct that wanted to clench down tighter with every difficult shot. Isa practiced this conscious loosening for years afterward, becoming eventually one of the most respected archers to train under Maren in her long career. He told his own students much later that the hardest and most important lesson archery had ever taught him had nothing to do with stance or breath or the angle of the draw. It was learning that gripping harder in archery and in nearly everything else worth doing well was almost never the answer his frightened mind insisted it was, and that real precision, real control almost always lived on the other side of a grip soft enough to let the work flow the way it was meant to. Let us rest here a moment. Feel the body soft and heavy just where it is. If there's something tonight you've been gripping too tightly, some outcome you've been trying to force through sheer effort and tension, you can let your hold on it loosen by just a small measure right now, not all the way. Just enough to notice the difference. Your hands, wherever they're resting, don't need to hold on to anything at all tonight. Let them stay soft and open, the way Maren's hand looked around that bow, calm and capable precisely because it wasn't fighting for control. There's a story coming up about a porter who carried supplies for travelers along a high mountain pass. And the winter, he finally learned that the heaviest pack does not always make the safest journey. But for now, just stay here, in the quiet after the archer's story, and let your own breath continue finding its way without any help from you. High along a mountain pass that connected two distant valleys, where the trail wound upward through switchbacks cut into bare grey rock, and the air grew thin enough to make a traveller's lungs ache with each step, there worked a porter named Davin. For nearly 15 years, Davin had carried supplies and belongings for merchants and travellers crossing the pass, a route too steep and treacherous for most pack animals, requiring instead the strong backs of men willing to climb for hours beneath heavy loads strapped across their shoulders. Davin had built his reputation on reliability, and reliability, in his mind, had slowly come to mean one specific thing. He never let a traveller go without something they might need. If a merchant worried about sudden weather, Davin packed extra blankets just in case. If a traveller mentioned even a passing concern about altitude sickness, Davin packed additional medicines and remedies just in case. Over the years, his packs had grown heavier and heavier, not because any particular journey demanded it, but because Davin's own mind had grown increasingly preoccupied with every possible thing that might go wrong along the trail. And his solution to this preoccupation had always been the same. Add more to the pack, carry more supplies, prepare for every conceivable disaster, even ones that had never once actually occurred during all his years on this mountain. By his 15th winter as a porter, Davin's standard pack had grown to nearly twice the weight he had carried in his earlier years, filled with extra rope in case of an unlikely rock slide, extra fuel in case of an unexpected delay, extra dried food in case the weather trapped a party on the mountain for days longer than planned. Extra everything, accumulated slowly over years of anxious preparation until the weight itself had become its own kind of burden, one that slowed his pace considerably and left him utterly exhausted by the time he reached the far side of the pass. That particular winter brought an early, heavy snowfall, and Davin was hired to guide a small merchant family, a husband, wife, and their young daughter across the pass before the road became impassable for the season. True to his habits, Davin packed everything he could imagine the family might possibly need, his own load growing so heavy that even his considerable strength, built over 15 years of this work, struggled beneath it from the very first switchback. The merchant, a practical man named Orson, watched Davin struggling under the weight of his pack within the first hour of climbing and finally asked him directly why he carried so much when the weather, while cold, showed no immediate signs of turning dangerous. Davin explained, somewhat defensively, that a porter who failed to prepare for every possibility wasn't doing his job properly, that the mountain had taught him over many years never to assume conditions would remain favorable, that he had seen too many travelers caught unprepared by sudden storms or unexpected delays. Orson didn't argue the point directly, but as the day wore on and Davin's pace slowed more and more under the weight of his pack, falling further and further behind the rest of the party, despite his evident strength and experience, Orson began to notice something Davin himself seemed unable to see. The very preparation meant to keep the family safe was now becoming the greatest danger of the journey, since Davin's exhaustion threatened to leave him unable to guide them safely through the more treacherous sections of trail still ahead, sections that required a clear head and steady footing far more than they required extra rope or unused fuel. By mid-afternoon, with the light beginning to fade and a genuine concern growing about reaching the shelter hut before dark, Orson finally asked Davin to stop and set his pack down for a moment. Davin protested, insisting he could continue, but Orson, with the quiet firmness of a man who had hired this porter precisely for his judgment and now needed to call on that judgment in a different way, asked Davin to simply consider honestly what was actually inside the pack, weighing him down so severely. They sat together on a flat outcropping of grey rock, the wind cutting cold across the exposed pass, and went through the contents of Davin's pack item by item. The extra rope, Davin admitted, had never once been needed in 15 years of crossing this particular section of trail, since the route itself required no climbing equipment at all. The extra medicines, while reasonable in small quantity, had been packed in amounts sufficient for a party 3 times the size of the small family Davin was currently guiding. The additional blankets, while warm and useful in genuine emergency, numbered nearly double what even the worst storm on this particular pass had ever required during Davin's entire career. Item by item, Davin began to see, laid out plainly on the cold rock before him, just how much of his pack's weight came not from the actual demands of this particular crossing, but from a kind of accumulated fear built up slowly over years that had convinced him every possible disaster needed its own specific preparation, carried physically on his back at all times. Orson asked him a question that Davin would carry with him for the rest of his career. He asked whether Davin believed that carrying enough supplies to handle every conceivable disaster was actually possible, even in principle, or whether there would always be some new disaster, some new possibility his anxious mind could imagine, that would demand he add yet another item to an already overburdened pack. Davin sat with this question for a long moment, the cold mountain wind moving across the exposed rock, the family waiting patiently a short distance ahead, the fading light reminding all of them that the shelter hut still lay some distance up the trail. He admitted quietly that there would probably always be some new fear his mind could generate, some new scenario that felt urgent enough to justify more weight on his back, and that he had perhaps spent years confusing the feeling of being prepared with the actual safety that real preparation was supposed to provide. Together, he and Orson removed nearly a third of the items from Davin's pack, leaving them in a small cache beneath the outcropping to be collected on his return journey. The pack that remained still carried real, useful supplies, enough rope for genuine need, enough food and warmth for the actual conditions of this particular crossing, but stripped of the years of accumulated fear that had made his work so much harder than it needed to be. Davin stood and lifted the lightened pack onto his shoulders, and the difference was immediate and dramatic. His pace through the remaining switchbacks quickened considerably, his breathing eased, and the party reached the shelter hut with enough daylight remaining to settle in comfortably before the deep cold of the mountain night fully arrived. Davin continued porting travelers across that pass for another decade, but he never again let his pack grow to the size it had reached that particular winter. He developed instead a simple practice of asking himself before every crossing whether each item in his pack served the actual journey ahead of him, the real weather, the real distance, the real needs of the particular travelers he was guiding, rather than some imagined worst case his tired, anxious mind had conjured from years of accumulated worry. He told a younger porter, training under him in his final years on the mountain, that the heaviest pack rarely makes the safest journey. More often, it simply makes the porter too exhausted to respond well when something genuinely difficult does arise, and that real preparedness has far more to do with a clear head and steady legs than with the sheer volume of supplies strapped across a person's back. Let us rest here a moment. Feel the body soft and heavy just where it is. If you've been carrying extra weight tonight, supplies for disasters that haven't happened and likely never will, you can set some of that down right now just for tonight and trust that you'll still be capable and ready for whatever tomorrow actually brings. Rather than every version of tomorrow your tired mind has imagined. Your shoulders can lower just slightly, the way Davin's did on that cold mountain outcropping. There's nothing strapped to your back right now but the simple, ordinary weight of your own resting body. And that's exactly enough. Now I want to tell you about a young scribe in a quiet monastery whose hand trembled every time he lifted his pen to copy a sacred text, certain that even the smallest mistake would somehow undo all his careful work. But take your time settling here first. There's no need to rush toward the next story. In a quiet monastery built into the side of a forested hill, where the only sounds through most of the day were birdsong and the distant murmur of a stream running somewhere beyond the outer walls, there worked a young scribe named Pharaoh. In a quiet monastery built into the side of a forested hill, where the only sounds through most of the day were birdsong and the distant murmur of a stream running somewhere beyond the outer walls, there worked a young scribe named Pharaoh. Pharaoh had been chosen after years of careful training in the art of careful, beautiful handwriting, to begin copying a particular sacred text, an old and treasured manuscript that the monastery's elders considered among their most valuable possessions. This honor, rather than filling Pharaoh with confidence, had instead settled into him as a source of near constant dread. He understood with painful clarity the weight of what he had been asked to do. A single mistake, a smudged letter, an uneven line, a moment of trembling concentration that left a character slightly malformed, could mar an entire page of careful work that had taken him hours, sometimes an entire day, to complete. The other monks who had copied this same text in years past had left behind pages of remarkable, flowing beauty, each character perfectly formed, each line evenly spaced, the kind of work that made viewers pause in quiet admiration when the finished manuscripts were eventually displayed in the monastery's small library. Pharaoh felt the weight of this legacy pressing down on him every single time he sat at his small wooden desk in the scriptorium, inkpot and brush arranged carefully before him, the candlelight flickering softly against the stone walls in the early morning hours before the rest of the monastery woke. His hand, which had moved with reasonable confidence during his years of practice on ordinary paper, began to tremble noticeably whenever he lifted his brush toward the actual sacred text he had been entrusted to copy. The trembling made his work worse, not better. Characters that should have flowed in smooth, confident strokes came out slightly uneven, slightly hesitant, the marks of a hand too anxious to commit fully to each movement. Pharaoh found himself starting pages over again and again, discarding sheet after sheet of expensive paper, each one marred by some small imperfection. That to his exhausted, anxious eye seemed like an unforgivable failure. Weeks passed this way, with Pharaoh producing far less finished work than expected, his small storage chest filling instead with discarded, half-finished pages that he couldn't bring himself to consider acceptable. The monastery's head scribe, an elderly monk named Brother Halen, who had copied this same sacred text himself decades earlier as a young man, finally asked to see Pharaoh's discarded pages one quiet evening after most of the other monks had retired for the night. Pharaoh brought the small chest to him reluctantly, ashamed of how little finished work he had to show after so many weeks of effort. Brother Halen sat by the candlelight and went through the discarded pages slowly, one by one, examining each supposed failure with the careful attention of a man who had spent his entire life studying the particular shapes and rhythms of this exact kind of careful handwriting. After a long while, he looked up at Pharaoh with an expression the young scribe couldn't quite read. He asked Pharaoh to look closely at one particular page, pointing to a character partway down that Pharaoh had rejected for an uneven stroke, a slight wobble in one of the brush lines that had felt, to Pharaoh's anxious eye, like a glaring and unacceptable flaw. Brother Halen asked Pharaoh to compare this character to the same character on a page from the original manuscript they were copying, a manuscript created by a scribe centuries earlier whose work had been considered masterful enough to preserve and revere for generations. Pharaoh looked closely and, to his genuine surprise, found a very similar small irregularity in the ancient original, a place where the long-dead scribe's own hand had clearly wavered slightly, producing a character not entirely unlike the one Pharaoh had just rejected as a failure. Brother Halen explained gently that he had spent 40 years studying this particular manuscript and others like it, and that every single one, without exception, contained these small human irregularities, places where a scribe's hand had trembled slightly, where a line had come out a touch uneven, where the work bore the unmistakable marks of having been made by a living person rather than some impossible machine of perfect, unwavering precision. He told Pharaoh that this had never diminished the manuscript's value in the eyes of those who studied and revered them. If anything, these small human marks were part of what made each manuscript a genuine living document rather than a cold, mechanical reproduction, evidence of a real person sitting at a real desk, candlelight flickering, breath moving in and out, doing their careful best with the materials and skill available to them in that particular moment. Pharaoh asked how he was supposed to continue his work without the constant fear that any small irregularity would ruin the entire effort. Brother Halen considered this question for a long while, the candle between them burning low, casting long shadows across the stone walls of the quiet scriptorium. He said that somewhere in Pharaoh's training, the actual goal of the work, faithfully transmitting this sacred text so that future generations could read and learn from it, had quietly transformed into a different goal entirely, the goal of producing something flawless, something beyond the reach of ordinary human hands. These two goals, he said, while related, were not actually the same thing, and chasing the second one too hard would always make the first one harder to achieve, since a hand gripped tight with the fear of imperfection trembles far more than a hand simply doing its honest, careful best. He told Pharaoh that the manuscript didn't need to be perfect in order to be valuable. It needed to be faithful, careful, and made with genuine attention, the kind of attention that comes naturally when a person isn't simultaneously terrified of every possible mistake. He suggested that Pharaoh try something the following morning. Rather than aiming for a flawless page, he should simply aim for an honest one, doing his careful best with each character, and then, regardless of small irregularities, continuing forward rather than starting over, again and again in pursuit of a perfection that, as the centuries-old original proved, had never actually existed even among the most celebrated scribes of the past. The next morning, Pharaoh sat at his desk with this new understanding settling slowly into his chest. His hand still trembled slightly as he lifted his brush, old habits rarely disappearing overnight, but when a particular character came out a touch uneven, he made himself continue rather than discarding the entire page, remembering the small human irregularities Brother Halen had shown him in that centuries-old manuscript. By the end of that day, he had completed an entire page, the first complete page he had managed to finish in nearly 3 weeks. It wasn't flawless. A careful eye could find, here and there, small places where his hand had wavered slightly, where a line wasn't perfectly even, but it was honest, careful work, faithfully copying the sacred text in front of him. And when he finally showed it to Brother Halen, the old monk studied it for a long moment before nodding slowly, the closest thing to genuine praise Pharaoh had received since beginning this difficult assignment. Pharaoh went on to copy several more sacred texts over the following decades, eventually becoming a respected teacher of the craft himself, training younger scribes who arrived at the monastery with the same trembling hands and anxious hearts he himself had once carried into that quiet scriptorium. He told each of them, in time, about the small, wavering character he had once rejected as an unforgivable failure, and how an old monk's patient wisdom had taught him that the goal was never perfection, only honest, careful presence, brought again and again to each new line, regardless of how the line before it had turned out. Let us rest here a moment. Feel the body soft and heavy just where it is. If you've been gripping a pen or a task or a piece of your own life too tightly tonight, terrified that any small imperfection will undo everything, you can loosen that grip just slightly. Your work doesn't need to be flawless to be valuable. It only needs to be honest, made with whatever attention and care you had available to you in that particular moment, trembling hand and all. There's a gentler story now about a woman who scrubbed cloth in a cold river every morning, certain that some stains existed even when her own eyes could no longer find them. Stay soft. Stay heavy. Let your breath continue finding its own way, the way it always has, long before tonight and long after, beside a wide, slow river that ran through a quiet farming village where mist often gathered low over the water in the early morning hours, and the bank was lined with smooth, flat stones worn pale by generations of women kneeling there before sunrise. There lived a washerwoman named Talia. Talia had taken over this work from her own mother many years earlier, washing the linens and clothing of several households in the village, kneeling on those same smooth stones each morning, her hands moving through cold water that numbed her fingers within minutes, regardless of the season. She took great pride in the brightness and cleanliness of the cloth she returned to each household, and for many years this pride had served her well, earning her a reputation throughout the village as the most reliable and skilled washerwoman anyone could remember. Something had shifted, though, in the past year or so, in a way Talia herself struggled to fully understand or explain. Worse still, the extra time required for this triple grinding meant Corvin could process far less grain overall, even though each batch, by the time it finally emerged from the mill, was technically finer than anything his father or grandfather had ever produced. She had begun noticing stains that by all reasonable measures no longer existed. A faint shadow on a white shirt that any other eye would have called perfectly clean, but that Talia's own gaze kept returning to, certain that some trace of the original stain remained, hidden in the weave of the fabric, waiting to reappear and embarrass her in front of the household that had trusted her with their laundry. She began scrubbing each piece of cloth far longer than necessary, sometimes returning to the same garment 3 or 4 times across a single morning, working the fabric against the smooth stones until her hands were raw, and the cloth itself, in some cases, had begun to thin and weaken from the repeated vigorous scrubbing. Her mornings, once finished within 2 or 3 hours, now stretched well into the afternoon, the growing pile of cloth she had decided wasn't yet clean enough sitting beside her on the riverbank, demanding more of her already exhausted attention. One particular morning, an old woman named Bettina, who had lived beside the river her entire long life and often sat on a nearby bench, simply watching the water move past, called Talia, over during a brief pause in her scrubbing. Bettina asked to see the shirt Talia had been working on for nearly half an hour, a plain white garment that, from where Bettina sat, appeared entirely clean. Talia brought it over, somewhat embarrassed, and pointed to a faint area near the collar, where she insisted a shadow of the original stain remained, visible if you tilted the fabric just so in the morning light. Bettina took the shirt and examined it carefully, turning it in the light exactly as Talia had instructed, and after a long moment admitted honestly that she could see nothing there at all, no shadow, no mark, simply clean white cloth. Talia insisted the mark was there, that she could see it clearly. that perhaps Bettina's older eyes simply weren't catching what her own younger, sharper vision could detect. Bettina considered this possibility seriously, since she was indeed quite elderly, and her eyesight had certainly weakened over the years. But she asked Talia a different question, one that had nothing to do with eyesight at all. She asked how long Talia had been scrubbing this particular shirt, and Talia admitted somewhat reluctantly that it had been nearly 30 minutes, far longer than any ordinary stain should reasonably require. Bettina nodded slowly and asked whether Talia remembered a time not so long ago when a shirt like this one would have taken her only a few minutes to wash thoroughly and confidently set aside as finished. Talia admitted that she did remember this, that her work had once moved with an easy, confident rhythm she could no longer seem to access, no matter how hard she tried. Bettina was quiet for a while, watching the river move slowly past the smooth stones, the morning mist beginning to burn away under the strengthening sun. She told Talia something her own mother had told her many decades earlier in nearly this exact spot, when Bettina herself had gone through a similar season of doubt in her own washing work. She said that there comes a point for almost everyone who does careful work of any kind where the eye stops looking for actual stains and starts looking instead for reassurance, for some feeling of certainty that the work is truly, completely finished beyond any possible doubt. The trouble, she said, is that this kind of certainty doesn't actually exist, not for washing, not for nearly anything in life that matters. A piece of cloth can always be scrubbed one more time. A worry can always be examined from one more angle. A decision can always be second-guessed with one more round of careful consideration. The eye searching for total, unquestionable certainty will always find some reason to keep searching, some faint shadow that might or might not be real, some small uncertainty that feels, in the moment, too important to simply let go. Bettina asked Talia to try something different with the next piece of cloth she washed that morning. Rather than scrubbing until she felt completely, perfectly certain that every possible trace of every possible stain had been removed, she asked Talia to simply scrub thoroughly with real attention and care for the amount of time her own experience told her was genuinely reasonable, and then to set the cloth aside, trusting her own trained, skilled hands, rather than chasing an impossible, perfect certainty that would never actually arrive no matter how long she scrubbed. Talia tried this with the next garment, a child's dress that needed washing for a family down the lane. She scrubbed it carefully, thoroughly, for perhaps 10 minutes, the amount of time her experienced hands told her was genuinely needed, and then, with real effort, made herself set it aside, rather than returning to examine it again and again under the shifting morning light. The anxious voice in her mind protested loudly, insisting that surely some stain remained, that she was being careless, that the family would notice and judge her harshly for it. But she held to her decision, hung the dress to dry, and moved on to the next piece of cloth waiting in her basket. By the time the morning ended, Talia had finished nearly twice as much laundry as she had managed in recent weeks, despite scrubbing each piece for considerably less time than she had grown accustomed to. No family that week complained of any remaining stains. If anything, several households commented that their clothing seemed to be lasting longer, the fabric less worn and thin than it had been in recent months, though none of them understood the reason behind this small improvement. Talia continued washing clothes beside that river for another 20 years, eventually training her own daughter in the craft, kneeling together on those same smooth stones worn pale by generations of careful hands. She told her daughter, when the same anxious habit began creeping into the younger woman's own work years later, about the morning Bettina had asked her to simply trust her trained hands rather than chase an impossible certainty that no amount of scrubbing could ever fully provide. She said that real cleanliness, like most things worth doing well, comes from careful, honest attention given once, thoroughly, rather than from endless, anxious repetition chasing a feeling of certainty that was never actually available to begin with. Let us rest here a moment. Feel the body soft and heavy just where it is. If you've been scrubbing at something tonight, some worry or some piece of work, searching for a certainty that keeps slipping just out of reach no matter how long you work at it, you can set it down now, trusting the careful effort you've already given it. The cloth is clean enough. The work is done enough. Your hands, however tired, have already done what they needed to do. I want to tell you about a miller now beside a river not unlike the one Talia knelt beside, who became convinced that his flour needed to be ground finer and finer until his wheel could no longer turn properly under the strain. But there's no rush. Let your body continue settling heavier now than it was even a few minutes ago into whatever is holding you tonight, beside a river that turned a great wooden wheel from sunrise until well past dark. In a village known throughout the region for the quality of its bread, there lived a miller named Corvin, who had inherited the mill from a long line of millers stretching back further than anyone in the village could clearly remember. Corvin took enormous pride in the fineness of his flour, believing, as his father and grandfather had believed before him, that the quality of bread depended almost entirely on how finely the grain had been ground before it ever reached a baker's hands. For most of his career, this belief had served him reasonably well, producing flour fine enough to satisfy even the most particular bakers in neighboring villages, who often traveled some distance specifically to purchase grain ground at Corvin's mill rather than at others closer to their own homes. But somewhere in his middle years, this reasonable pride began to shift into something heavier and more demanding. Corvin became convinced that his flour, fine as it already was, could always be ground a little finer still, and that this additional fineness would somehow produce noticeably better bread, justifying the additional time and strain it placed on both himself and his old wooden mill wheel. He began running each batch of grain through the millstones not once, as had always been standard practice, but twice, sometimes 3 times, grinding and regrinding the same flour until it had become so fine that it nearly resembled a kind of pale, soft dust, far beyond what any baker had ever actually requested or required. This additional grinding came at a real cost. The old mill wheel, built generations earlier and already showing the wear of decades of constant use, began groaning under the additional strain of this repeated grinding, the wooden gears creaking ominously in ways Corvin's own father had taught him many years earlier to recognize as a warning sign rather than something to ignore. The millstones themselves, designed to grind grain a single time before the flour was collected, wore down far more quickly than they ever had before, requiring more frequent and expensive replacement, the kind of cost that ate steadily into the modest profits Corvin's mill had always reliably produced. Worse still, the extra time required for this triple grinding meant Corvin could process far less grain overall, even though each batch, by the time it finally emerged from the mill, was technically finer than anything his father or grandfather had ever produced. Bakers who had once received their orders within a single day now waited 2, sometimes 3 days for the same amount of flour, and several of them, frustrated by the delay despite the marginal improvement in fineness, began taking their business to other, less obsessive mills in neighboring villages instead. One autumn evening, an old baker named Wenrick, who had purchased flour from Corvin's family mill for nearly 40 years and had grown genuinely fond of the miller over the decades, stopped by to discuss the increasingly long delays affecting his own bread production. He found Corvin standing beside the groaning mill wheel, looking exhausted, his clothes coated in the fine pale dust that now seemed to cover every surface of the mill house, the strain of months of overwork etched clearly into his face. Wenrick asked gently why the mill had grown so slow in recent months, since the flour itself, while undeniably fine, hadn't actually changed the quality of his bread in any way Wenrick or his customers had noticed. Corvin explained his belief, the one that had grown so strong in his mind over recent months, that finer flour must inevitably produce better bread, and that the additional grinding, while costly in time and wear on the mill, was therefore worth the sacrifice. Wenrick considered this for a long moment, watching the tired old wheel turn slowly in the darkening evening light, the river beneath it moving steadily along as it always had. He told Corvin something that genuinely surprised the exhausted miller. He said that he had been baking bread from Corvin's family mill for 40 years, through Corvin's father's time and now Corvin's own, and that in all those decades he had never once noticed a meaningful difference in his bread's quality based on small variations in the flour's fineness. What mattered far more, Wenrick explained, was the freshness of the grain itself, the quality of the wheat before it was ever ground, and the skill of the baker working with whatever flour eventually arrived at his door. A flour ground once, properly and with reasonable care, produced bread every bit as good as flour ground 3 times into an almost impossibly fine dust. But the once ground flour arrived faster, allowed the mill to process more grain overall, and placed far less strain on equipment that, Wenrick gently pointed out, sounded as though it might not survive many more months of this kind of repeated overwork. Corvin protested at first, certain that his careful attention to fineness represented genuine quality and craftsmanship, the kind of dedication his father had instilled in him from childhood. But Wenrick asked him a simple, direct question. He asked whether Corvin had ever actually received feedback from any baker in all the months of this triple grinding, specifically praising the additional fineness, or whether the only feedback he had received was frustration about the longer waiting times. Corvin sat with this question for a long while, the old wheel groaning softly beside them in the gathering dusk, and slowly admitted that no baker had ever once mentioned the fineness improving their bread, only the delays affecting their own work. He had been, he realized with a kind of quiet, uncomfortable clarity, pursuing a standard of quality that existed almost entirely in his own mind, a perfectionism that had grown disconnected from what his actual customers needed or wanted, all while genuinely believing he was honoring his family's legacy of careful, quality work. That night, Corvin made a decision that felt, in the moment, almost like a betrayal of everything his father and grandfather had taught him. He returned to grinding each batch of grain only once, the way the mill had been built and designed to operate, the way millers in his family had worked for generations before his recent habit had taken hold. The change in his mill's operation was immediate and significant. The old wheels' groaning eased noticeably within just a few weeks, the strain of repeated grinding no longer pulling at gears already worn from decades of honest use. He could process nearly 3 times the grain he had managed during his months of triple grinding, and bakers throughout the region, including Wenrick, soon found their orders arriving promptly again, the bread they produced from this flour every bit as good as it had ever been, despite Corvin's earlier conviction that something essential had been added by all that extra grinding. Corvin ran that mill for another 25 years, eventually training his own son in the craft, and he told the boy more than once about the autumn he had nearly worn out a mill that had served his family for generations, chasing a fineness that existed mainly in his own anxious mind rather than in any actual difference his customers could taste in their bread. He said that real craftsmanship sometimes means knowing when good enough is genuinely fully enough rather than always reaching for some additional, marginal improvement that costs far more than it's actually worth. Let us rest here a moment. Feel the body soft and heavy just where it is. If you've been grinding at something tonight, working and reworking it past the point where any real improvement remains, you can let the wheel slow down now, trusting that what you've already made, already done, already given is genuinely enough for tonight. Your own gears, tired from a long day of turning, are allowed to rest now too. There's another story waiting, this one about a night watchman in a granary who counted sacks of grain over and over through the long hours of darkness, convinced that one wrong number might somehow undo his entire reputation. But there's no need to hurry there. Stay here a while, in the quiet after the miller's story, feeling your own breath continue at whatever pace feels natural. In a large stone granary at the edge of a market town where wagons arrived each autumn loaded with the season's harvest of wheat and barley, there worked a night watchman named Felber, whose job was simply to guard the granary through the dark hours and ensure that nothing was disturbed, stolen, or damaged before the morning crew arrived to continue the work of weighing and distributing the grain to merchants throughout the region. Felber had held this position for nearly 6 years, ever since an injury to his leg had ended his earlier work as a farmhand and left him needing something quieter, something that didn't require the long hours of physical labor his leg could no longer comfortably manage. For the first several years, the work had suited him well enough. He walked the rows of sacks each evening when his shift began, made occasional rounds through the night by lantern light, and otherwise sat in a small chair near the granary's main door, listening to the quiet creak of the old stone building settling and the distant sounds of the town beyond its walls. Something had changed, though, after a particular incident 2 winters earlier, when a small theft had occurred during another watchman's shift at a neighboring granary. A handful of sacks disappeared overnight, never recovered. The responsible watchman dismissed in disgrace shortly afterward. This incident, though it had nothing directly to do with Felber's own granary, had settled into his mind with surprising weight, planting a seed of anxiety that grew steadily over the following months. Felber began counting the sacks of grain each evening when his shift began, a reasonable enough practice that matched standard procedure at granaries throughout the region. But where this count had once taken him perhaps 20 minutes at the start of each shift, satisfying him enough to settle into his quiet chair for the remainder of the night, it now became the first of many counts he felt compelled to perform throughout his long hours of duty. He would count the sacks at the start of his shift, then again 2 hours later, certain that his first count might have contained some small error. He would count a third time around midnight, his lantern light moving slowly across row after row of grain sacks stacked in the cool darkness, his lips moving silently as he tracked each number. By his final months in this anxious pattern, Felber was counting the granary's contents as many as 6 or 7 times in a single night. His sleep during the daytime hours growing increasingly fractured as his mind, even at home, continued running through numbers and rows, and the persistent fear that he might somehow miscount, might somehow miss a discrepancy that would only become apparent the following morning, when it would be far too late to address. His employer, a practical grain merchant named Ostlin, began noticing the dark circles beneath Felber's eyes, the way his hands had taken on a slight, persistent tremor, the way he seemed increasingly distracted and exhausted even during conversations that had nothing to do with his work at all. One evening, arriving at the granary earlier than usual for an unrelated errand, Ostlin found Felber in the middle of what was clearly not his first count of the night, lantern held high, lips moving as he tracked numbers across row after row of grain sacks, his expression tight with concentration and something that looked to Ostlin's experienced eye very much like genuine fear. Ostlin waited until Felber finished this particular count and then asked him directly how many times he typically counted the granary's contents during a single night shift. Felber, embarrassed, admitted the truth that some nights it reached 6 or 7 separate counts, each one performed with the same careful, anxious attention as the first. Ostlin asked a simple question that Felber found surprisingly difficult to answer. He asked whether in 6 years of this work, including the 2 years of this particular counting habit, Felber had ever once discovered, through any of these repeated counts, an actual discrepancy in the granary's stores. Felber thought back carefully through his years of service and admitted, somewhat startled by his own realization, that he never had. Every single count across hundreds of nights and thousands of individual tallies had always matched the number recorded at the close of the previous workday. Not once, in all his anxious checking, had he actually caught a problem before it would have been discovered anyway by the morning crew's standard procedures. Ostlin sat down on an overturned crate near the granary's entrance and asked Felber to join him for a few minutes before continuing his rounds. He explained that he understood, perhaps better than Felber realized, the particular fear that had clearly taken hold of him since the theft at the neighboring granary 2 winters earlier. He admitted that he himself had felt a flicker of that same fear when he first heard the news, a worry about whether his own granary, his own watchman, might be equally vulnerable. But he told Felber something that the watchman hadn't fully considered in his months of anxious counting. He explained that the stone walls of this particular granary, built thick and solid generations earlier, combined with the heavy iron lock on its only door and the simple fact of Felber's own steady presence through the night, already provided real, substantial security. The kind that didn't depend on counting the sacks 7 times to remain effective. A thief looking to steal grain needed opportunity, needed an unwatched building or an absent watchman, conditions that simply didn't exist here, regardless of how many times Felber counted or didn't count throughout his shift. The counting itself, Ostlin gently pointed out, had never actually been the thing keeping the grain safe. Felber's simple, steady presence through the night, His willingness to make reasonable rounds and remain alert to any unusual sound or disturbance was what mattered. The repeated counting had become instead a kind of ritual meant to soothe an anxious mind rather than a practice that genuinely added to the granary's security. And in soothing that anxiety through counting, Felber had inadvertently made himself more exhausted, less alert, and ultimately less capable of responding well to any genuine disturbance that might actually occur. Felber asked, somewhat sheepishly, what he should do instead, since simply stopping the counting altogether felt, even as Ostlin explained all of this, almost impossible to imagine. Ostlin suggested a middle path. Felber would count once, carefully and thoroughly at the start of each shift, exactly as standard practice required, and then trust that count for the remainder of the night, focusing his attention instead on simply staying alert, making his regular rounds and listening for any genuinely unusual sound, rather than running through numbers again and again in an attempt to manufacture a certainty that, as Felber himself had just realized, the repeated counting had never actually provided in the first place. Felber tried this new approach the following week and found the first few nights genuinely difficult, his mind pulling hard toward the old anxious habit every time a shadow shifted or a sound echoed unexpectedly through the stone building. But he held to his new practice, counting once and then trusting that count, and gradually over the following weeks found himself sleeping more soundly during the daytime hours, his hand steadier, his attention during each shift sharper and more genuinely present, rather than scattered across the exhausting work of constant, repeated verification. Felber continued watching that granary for another 8 years until his leg finally required him to retire from even this quieter work. In all those years, the granary's stores were never once compromised. The thick stone walls and heavy iron lock and Felber's own steady, well-rested presence proving more than sufficient protection, exactly as Ostlin had suggested that evening on the overturned crate. Felber told a younger watchman hired to replace him in his final year that the most important lesson of his long career had nothing to do with counting accurately. It was learning that real safety rarely comes from anxious repetition, and that a well-rested, genuinely alert mind protects far more effectively than an exhausted one running through the same numbers again and again, chasing a certainty that careful counting, no matter how many times repeated, was never actually capable of providing. Let us rest here a moment. Feel the body soft and heavy just where it is. If you've been counting something tonight, some number of worries or tasks or possible problems, running through the same tally again and again without ever quite reaching the certainty you're chasing, you can count once tonight and trust that count completely. Whatever has been steady and safe all along will remain steady and safe whether you check it once more or not. There's a story waiting now about a boat builder who kept adding weight to his small fishing boat, convinced that more iron and more ballast would keep it safer in rough water, until the boat itself could barely float at all. But take your time getting there. Let your body continue sinking heavier now into whatever has been holding you this entire time. In a small fishing harbour where the boats were modest and the waters beyond the breakwater could turn rough with little warning, there lived a boat builder named Ison, well known throughout the harbour for the sturdiness of his vessels. Ison had learned his craft from his own father, a careful and methodical man who had built boats for nearly 50 years without ever losing a single customer, to the kind of accident that occasionally claimed less well-built vessels in nearby harbours, when Issen's father finally retired, passing the small boatyard along to his son. Issen carried forward this same careful attention to sturdiness and safety, determined to maintain the family's reputation for building boats that fishermen could trust with their lives in even the roughest weather the sea might offer. This determination, reasonable enough at its foundation, began to shift gradually over the years into something heavier and more anxious. Issen had witnessed, early in his independent career, a terrible storm that claimed 2 boats from a neighbouring harbour, vessels built by a competitor known for prioritizing speed and lightness over the kind of sturdy construction Issen's own family had always favoured. This event, though it involved boats entirely unrelated to his own work, settled into Issen's mind as a kind of warning, a reminder of how quickly the sea could turn dangerous for any vessel not built with sufficient strength and stability. In the years that followed, Issen began adding more and more reinforcement to every boat he built. Heavier timber for the hull, additional iron fittings at every joint, extra ballast stone secured low in the bilge to improve stability in rough seas. Each addition, taken individually, seemed reasonable enough, a sensible precaution against the kind of disaster he had witnessed in his early career. But taken together, accumulated boat by boat over nearly a decade, these additions had transformed Issen's vessels into something far heavier and slower than the boats his own father had once built, boats that handled beautifully in calm water, but that struggled noticeably whenever fishermen needed to move quickly, whether to reach a promising school of fish before competitors arrived or to outrun a sudden storm building on the horizon. Fishermen who purchased Issen's boats began noticing this growing sluggishness, the way the vessels sat lower in the water than they once had, the way they responded more slowly to the wind filling their sails, the additional effort required at the oars whenever the wind failed entirely and rowing became necessary. Several long-time customers, families who had purchased boats from Issen's father for generations, began quietly taking their business elsewhere, to builders who hadn't let their own reasonable caution accumulate into something this burdensome. One particular afternoon, an old fisherman named Tobin, who had sailed boats built by Issen's family for nearly 40 years, stopped by the boatyard to discuss a new vessel he hoped to commission for his grown son, who was preparing to take over the family's fishing work. Tobin watched as Issen proudly showed him the latest boat under construction, pointing out the heavy timber reinforcement, the additional iron fittings, the substantial ballast already secured in the bilge, each addition described with the same careful pride Issen brought to every aspect of his craft. Tobin, rather than sharing in this pride, grew visibly concerned as he examined the half-finished vessel, running his weathered hand along the unusually thick hull, testing the considerable weight already built into a boat that wasn't yet even complete. He asked Issen directly how this boat compared, in actual weight, to vessels Issen's father had built decades earlier, boats Tobin himself remembered fondly from his younger years on the water. Issen, somewhat defensively, admitted that his boats had grown considerably heavier over the years, though he framed this as a positive development, evidence of his commitment to building vessels that could withstand even the worst weather the sea might offer. Tobin considered this for a long moment, still running his hand along the thick hull, and then asked a question that clearly surprised Issen. He asked whether Issen had ever actually lost a customer's boat to a storm in all his years of building these increasingly heavy, reinforced vessels. Æson admitted that he hadn't, a fact he had always considered proof that his approach was working exactly as intended. But Tobin pointed out something Æson hadn't fully considered. He asked whether Æson's father, building lighter boats with considerably less reinforcement, had ever lost a customer's vessel to a storm either during his own 5 decades of careful, successful work. Æson admitted, somewhat reluctantly, that his father's record had been equally spotless, that no vessel built by either generation of their family had ever actually been lost at sea. Tobin nodded slowly and explained something he had observed over his own many decades on the water, watching different builders' boats handle different conditions throughout his long fishing career. He said that a boat's safety in rough water came from many factors working together: the skill and judgment of the fisherman sailing it, the quality of the materials and craftsmanship in its construction, the soundness of its basic design, far more than from sheer accumulated weight and reinforcement piled on top of an already solid foundation. In fact, he suggested gently, a boat too heavy and sluggish could become its own kind of danger, slow to respond when quick maneuvering mattered most, struggling to outrun a storm that a lighter, more responsive vessel might have escaped entirely. The very weight Æson had added year after year in pursuit of greater safety might actually be working against the safety he hoped to provide, trading one kind of theoretical risk, a hull not strong enough for rough seas, for another, very real and present risk, a boat too heavy and slow to respond well when speed and maneuverability mattered most. Æson sat with this perspective for several days after Tobin's visit, walking through his boatyard, examining the increasingly heavy vessels he had been producing in recent years, comparing them in his memory to the lighter, more responsive boats his father had built decades earlier. He found, with some discomfort, that he could no longer clearly remember the exact reasoning that had led him to add each successive layer of reinforcement over the years, only that each individual addition had felt, in its own moment, like a reasonable precaution against the kind of disaster he had witnessed early in his career. A disaster that had never actually happened to any boat he himself had built, with or without all this additional weight. For Tobin's son's new boat, Æson made a deliberate decision to return closer to the proportions his own father had favored decades earlier, sturdy and well-built, but without the accumulated excess of recent years. The boat that emerged from this approach moved through the water with a responsiveness Æson had nearly forgotten was possible, light enough to move quickly when speed mattered, while still solid and well constructed enough to handle genuinely rough conditions with confidence. Tobin's son sailed that boat for over 20 years through storms and calm seas alike, without incident, and several other long-time customers, hearing of this change in Æson's approach, returned to commission their own vessels built along these same lighter, more balanced lines. Æson continued building boats for another 2 decades, eventually finding a careful balance between his father's original lightness and his own genuine, valuable instinct toward sturdy, safe construction, no longer letting reasonable caution accumulate year after year into something heavier than any actual danger required. He told his own son, eventually training to take over the boatyard in turn, about the years he had spent adding weight upon weight in pursuit of a safety that sturdy, thoughtful design had already provided from the very beginning, and how Tobin's gentle, honest question had finally helped him see what his own anxious additions had nearly cost generations of fishermen who depended on his family's boats. Let us rest here a moment. Feel the body soft and heavy just where it is. If you've been adding weight to something tonight, extra precautions, extra worry, extra reinforcement against dangers that may never actually arrive, you can set some of that down now, trusting that what you've already built, already prepared, already become, carries more genuine strength than your anxious mind gives it credit for. There's one more story I want to share with you tonight about a map maker who spent so many years trying to chart every possible path before setting out on any journey at all that he very nearly never left his own small study. After that, we'll let the stories rest completely and turn our full attention simply to your breathing body, heavy now, sinking deeper into wherever you're resting tonight. In a small village known for its careful records and its long tradition of skilled cartography, there lived a map maker named Ondrik, who had inherited both his father's trade and his father's modest collection of maps and charting instruments, housed in a small study lined with shelves of carefully labelled scrolls and a wide wooden desk worn smooth by generations of careful hands. Ondrik had been commissioned, in his middle years, by a group of merchants hoping to establish a new trading route through a stretch of unfamiliar hill country to the east, terrain that existing maps covered only in vague, uncertain detail, full of question marks and educated guesses left behind by earlier cartographers who had never personally travelled through that particular region. This commission represented for Ondrik both a tremendous opportunity and a source of mounting anxiety that grew steadily more consuming as the weeks passed. He understood that an accurate map of this hill country could open valuable trade for the entire village, but he also understood with painful clarity the responsibility this placed on his own careful work, since merchants and travellers would eventually trust their safety and their livelihoods to whatever path he eventually charted through unfamiliar terrain. Rather than setting out to survey the actual hills himself, as his father had always done before committing any new route to careful paper, Ondrik instead began an increasingly elaborate process of research and preparation, determined to understand every possible danger and obstacle before ever stepping foot beyond the village's familiar boundaries. He gathered every existing account from traders and travellers who had passed anywhere near that hill country in past decades, cross-referencing their scattered, often contradictory descriptions, trying to piece together a complete picture of the terrain before committing to any actual route. He consulted old astronomical charts to calculate precise distances based on second-hand descriptions of landmarks he had never personally seen. He spent months poring over these gathered fragments of information, sketching tentative routes on scrap paper, only to discard each one when some new piece of second-hand information raised a fresh concern about a particular ravine or a particular river crossing, or a particular stretch of terrain that might prove more difficult than his current calculations suggested. Weeks turned into months, and months began approaching a full year, with Ondrik still sitting in his small study, surrounded by an ever-growing collection of notes, second-hand accounts, and tentative, discarded route sketches, no closer to actually setting out to survey the hill country himself than he had been when he first accepted the merchant's commission. The merchants who had hired him grew increasingly impatient, sending messages asking about his progress, messages that Ondrik found himself dreading more with each passing week, since he genuinely had little tangible progress to report beyond an ever-expanding collection of research that, despite its volume, had brought him no closer to an actual, usable map. One particular evening, Ondrik's old mentor, a retired cartographer named Vesa, who had trained both Ondrik and his father decades earlier in the careful art of map-making, paid a visit to the small study, having heard through village gossip about the young map-maker's growing difficulties with this important commission. She found Ondrik surrounded by stacks of paper, his desk barely visible beneath layers of notes and discarded sketches, his expression exhausted and increasingly desperate as the merchant's deadline drew nearer, with seemingly no resolution in sight. Vesa asked to see his work, and Ondrik, somewhat embarrassed, walked her through the elaborate collection of second-hand accounts and careful calculations he had assembled over the past year, explaining each contradiction between different travelers' descriptions, each uncertainty he still needed to resolve before he could feel confident enough to commit any particular route to his final map. Vesa listened patiently for a long while, examining the scattered notes with the same careful attention she had always brought to her own work decades earlier. When Ondrik finally finished his lengthy explanation, she asked him a simple, direct question that seemed to catch him entirely off guard. She asked how many times in this past year of careful research he had actually walked out into the hill country himself, even for a single day, to see with his own eyes what these scattered second-hand accounts could only describe imperfectly from a distance. Ondrik admitted with visible discomfort that he hadn't gone even once, that he had been so consumed with gathering and reconciling information from others that the actual terrain itself remained, to his own direct experience, entirely unknown. Vesa nodded slowly, as though this answer confirmed something she had already suspected before even arriving at his study. She reminded him gently of something his own father had taught both of them many decades earlier in this very room, when she herself had been a young apprentice still learning the careful art of cartography. No map, she said, however thoroughly researched, however carefully calculated, from second-hand accounts and old astronomical charts, could ever fully replace the simple, direct experience of actually walking the land itself, feeling the particular texture of the ground beneath your own feet, seeing with your own eyes how a ravine actually narrowed at its most difficult crossing point, hearing for yourself how a river actually sounded as it moved across a particular stretch of rocky terrain that second-hand accounts could only describe in vague, contradictory terms. She told Ondrik that his year of careful research, while not entirely wasted, had reached a point of diminishing returns many months earlier, a point where additional second-hand information could no longer meaningfully improve his understanding of terrain he had never personally walked. Beyond that point, all his continued research had really accomplished was delaying the actual work that would finally resolve his uncertainty, the simple, direct work of setting out into those hills himself with his surveying instruments and his own careful eyes, gathering real, first-hand information that no amount of second-hand research could ever fully substitute for. Ondrik protested that the hill country was unfamiliar and potentially dangerous, that proper preparation seemed only sensible before setting out into terrain he didn't yet understand. Vesa acknowledged this concern as entirely reasonable, but pointed out gently that Ondrik had moved somewhere in this past year from reasonable preparation into something closer to avoidance, using the genuine uncertainty of unfamiliar terrain as a reason to never actually face that terrain directly, substituting endless research for the more frightening, more vulnerable work of simply walking out into unknown hills and discovering, through his own direct experience, what was actually there. She reminded him that his own father, decades earlier, had charted dozens of similarly unfamiliar routes throughout his long career, never through this kind of exhaustive second-hand research, but through reasonable, sensible preparation, followed by the courage to actually set out and survey the land directly, adjusting his understanding as he went, correcting his own initial assumptions whenever the actual terrain proved different from what he had expected before setting out. That conversation settled into Ondřich over the following days, uncomfortable but undeniably true. He recognized, looking honestly at his year of accumulated research, that he had indeed crossed somewhere from careful preparation into a kind of paralysis, convinced that just one more piece of second-hand information might finally provide the certainty he was searching for, when in truth, no amount of research conducted from the safety of his small study could ever fully replace the direct experience of actually walking the hills themselves. The following week, with reasonable but not exhaustive preparation, Ondřich finally set out into the hill country with his surveying instruments, a small amount of provisions, and a guide hired from a nearby village who had at least travelled part way into this terrain on previous occasions for unrelated reasons. The actual hills, when he finally walked among them, proved both easier and harder than his year of second-hand research had suggested. Certain ravines narrower and more manageable than feared, certain river crossings considerably more difficult than any account had adequately conveyed, details that no amount of additional research from his study could ever have revealed as clearly as his own direct, careful observation now provided within just the first few days of actual surveying. Within 6 weeks of direct, hands-on work, considerably less time than his year of preliminary research had consumed, Ondřich had charted a workable, reasonably accurate route through the hill country, complete enough to satisfy the merchants who had commissioned his work, and reliable enough that the trading route he established continued serving the village for decades afterward. Ondřich continued his work as the village's primary cartographer for many years following this experience, but he never again allowed research and preparation, however genuinely valuable in reasonable amounts, to substitute entirely for the direct, sometimes uncertain work of actually setting out to discover what could only be learned through first-hand experience. He told his own apprentice years later about the year he had nearly spent entirely within the safety of his small study, convinced that just a little more research would finally provide the certainty he needed before setting out, and how his old teacher had finally helped him see that some forms of certainty simply don't exist until you're willing to walk directly into the very uncertainty you've been trying so hard for so long to avoid. Let us rest here a moment. Feel the body soft and heavy just where it is. If you've been gathering information tonight, turning a decision over and over, searching for a certainty that keeps receding, the longer you search for it, you don't need to solve that tonight. You've already prepared more than enough. Whatever path waits for you tomorrow will reveal itself more clearly through living it than through any further amount of careful thinking tonight. Now let the stories rest completely. We've walked beside a river where a young shepherd finally learned to trust his fence and his dog, We've climbed a foggy hillside where a lamplighter learned that one careful pass was enough. We've stood in a forest clearing where an archer learned that a loosened grip sends the arrow truer than a desperate one. We've crossed a mountain pass where a porter learned that the lightest pack often makes the safest journey. We've sat in a quiet scriptorium where a trembling hand learned that honest work matters more than flawless work. We've knelt beside cold river stones where a washerwoman learned that some cloth is clean enough long before her anxious eyes were ready to believe it. We've stood beside an old mill wheel that learned again how to turn at a reasonable pace. We've spent the night in a stone granary where counting once, finally, became enough. We've watched a boat builder set down weight he never actually needed to carry, and we've followed a map maker out of his small study and into hills that turned out to be far more knowable through walking than through worrying. All of these stories live somewhere inside you now, settling quietly wherever your mind keeps the things that feel true. You don't need to remember any of the details. You don't need to hold on to any particular lesson. Just let them become part of the heaviness already spreading through your body, the same heaviness that tells you more clearly than any thought could that you are tired, and that tired is allowed and that rest is close now. Let's turn our full attention to that body exactly as it is in this moment. Notice, first, the surface beneath you, a mattress perhaps with its particular softness already shaped a little by the weight of you settling into it, a pillow holding your head at whatever angle feels most natural, a blanket or none at all, the air around you, whatever temperature it happens to be, neither too warm nor too cold, simply the air of this particular night. Let your attention move to your feet. Notice them without trying to change anything about how they feel. Maybe they're warm. Maybe they're cool against the sheets. Maybe you can barely feel them at all anymore, which is its own kind of good sign, a sign that they've stopped working, stopped carrying, stopped doing anything but resting completely. Let them grow heavier now, the way a sack of grain settles once it's finally set down after a long day's carrying, no longer needing to be lifted or moved or accounted for. Move your attention slowly up to your ankles, your calves, muscles that walked you through however many rooms and sidewalks and stairs made up your day. They don't have anywhere left to carry you tonight. Let them soften completely, the tension of the day draining out of them the way water drains slowly from cloth left to dry on a warm stone. Your knees can rest now too. All the bending, all the small adjustments they made today without you ever once having to think about them, all of that is finished. Let them settle into whatever position feels most natural, no correction needed, no perfect alignment required. Feel your thighs growing heavy now, the strong muscles that carried your entire weight through the day, finally allowed to simply lie still, sinking down into the mattress beneath them with each slow breath. Notice your hips and the base of your spine, often where the day's tension likes to gather and pool. Let this whole area soften the way Davin's shoulders eased once he finally set down the extra weight he'd been carrying up that mountain trail for so many unnecessary years. You don't need to hold anything here tonight. Let your stomach soften too, and your lower back, the places where worry so often takes up residence without you ever quite noticing it move in. Take one slow breath, and as you let it go, imagine it traveling specifically to this area, loosening whatever has gathered there, the way Talia's careful but reasonable scrubbing finally loosened even the stains that had only ever existed in her own anxious mind. There's nothing left for your stomach to hold on to tonight. Let it rest, simply, quietly, the way it was always meant to between one day and the next. Notice your chest now rising and falling with the same steady rhythm it's kept your entire life. Long before tonight, long before any of these stories, a rhythm that has never once needed your conscious management in order to continue. Trust it completely tonight, the same easy trust Isa finally found for his own loosened grip on the bow, the same trust Pell finally found for his fence and his dog. Let your shoulders drop now fully, the way we asked them to drop at the very start of this evening. Except now there's even more softness available to them, more permission to simply let go completely of whatever they've been holding since this morning. Let your arms grow heavy along your sides, your hands soft and open, fingers uncurled, nothing left to grip, nothing left to carry, nothing left to count or check or verify one more time. Notice your neck and the back of your head resting against whatever holds it. So much thinking happens up there day after day, an endless quiet stream of thoughts, not unlike the river that carried Talia's careful work downstream each morning. Let that stream continue tonight without you needing to reach in and grab hold of any particular thought as it drifts past. Let your jaw loosen, your teeth coming gently apart, your tongue resting softly, nothing left that needs explaining or arguing or convincing, not to anyone and especially not to yourself. Let your whole face soften now, the small muscles around your eyes and your forehead releasing whatever expression they've held all day. The same kind of honest, unguarded ease Faro finally found once he stopped chasing an impossible perfection and simply let his hand do its honest best. Feel your entire body now heavy from your softened feet all the way up to your unguarded, peaceful face, resting completely, held entirely by whatever is beneath you. You are not holding yourself up right now. Something steadier than your own effort is doing that work, the same way a well-built fence holds a flock through the night, the same way a sturdy boat, rightly built, holds steady through rough water. The same way good, simple ground holds an entire mountain trail beneath the feet of a traveler who has finally learned to carry only what the journey actually requires. You can trust that support completely tonight. There is nothing left for you to manage or fix or figure out before morning. The flock is safely behind its fence and the dog is listening. The lamps are lit and the fishermen know these waters by heart. The bow has been set down, your grip finally fully loosened. The pack is lighter now, carrying only what tonight actually requires. The page is finished, honest rather than flawless, and entirely enough. The cloth is clean and has been for some time now, however long your tired eyes kept searching for proof otherwise. The flour is ground exactly as much as it ever needed to be. The grain has been counted once, and that single count was always enough. The boat sits light and ready on calm water, and somewhere a mapmaker finally closed his books, picked up his instruments, and walked out into hills that turned out to be far kinder than all his careful worrying had imagined. Let your breath continue now, slow and unhurried, each inhale arriving gently on its own, each exhale carrying away whatever small weight remains. There is nothing left to do tonight and nothing left to understand. Sleep well.